Hey, good evening. It's good to see you here. Thanks for coming out. We're really appreciative of everybody's presence here tonight, and we're especially God, whose love is over all your children. We thank you so much for this opportunity to gather and to learn more about one another. We ask that you would help us to be very attentive to your holy presence here with us. Help us to learn that truly when one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts. Help us to find ways to bring healing and love and life to all your people so that together we might celebrate this amazing creation you have given to us and this awesome life. And this we pray in your precious and holy name. Amen.
I'd like to thank you for those words and welcome me back once again here. And so we'll try to speed up through this part of our discussion. That way we can maybe have a conversation towards the end. This is kind of probably one of the most difficult topics that I talk about in all my lecturing. Anything that has to do with historical trauma in Native people is always really difficult for some. In fact, I would even say that for those of you who are here, you're brave to be willing to listen to the lecture tonight because some of this information is really, really, really terrible. And a lot of folks really don't know about what Native Americans experienced and how that's really affecting us here in 2015. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Real quick, just a picture. I always like to start off with pictures. I think it sets the tone. So we have Crazy Horse, or not Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, a relative of Crazy Horse. And he's Minneconjou, Lakota, and he has his wife, his mother-in-law, I believe, and one of his children. And I really like this picture because it represents, I think, the best of Native American culture, represents the family, and that really is I think, the foundation of all of our communities. The foundation of humanity, right, is the family. Where would humanity be without the family? And so probably the most important institution, of course, would be family life. And here's another really nice picture. This is a Mandan family. They're also from the Great Plains area, and you can see husband, wife, and the children. And again, this is the foundation of Indian life here. Really, all of our lives, whether you're Native American or not, without the family, who are we as human beings? Another picture of a mother and her child. This child is wrapped up in a cradle board. Native Americans from the East Coast to the West Coast, usually when they had children, they would wrap them up in cradle boards. So the cradle boards in some cases are made out of hardwood. In other cases, they're made out of different materials. They utilize glass beads. They are embroidered with porcupine quills in some cases. This one right here is actually embroidered, I believe, with porcupine quills, which takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. So let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So what is historical trauma? I'll go ahead and read you some of this. It says, is largely seen as a phenomena related to various minority and oppressed populations due to the lingering impact of colonization. The impact of colonization, of course, what I'm referring to is the fact that Native American communities were literally invaded. Native Americans, in some cases, were murdered. Others were forced to leave their homelands, move on to Indian reservations. After Indian reservations were created here in North America, our reserves in Canada, Native American kids were then rounded up, often shipped off to boarding schools, and basically forced to make a transformation from being Native American to being something completely different. It's also referred to as multi-generational trauma as well, because the trauma is typically passed on from one generation to the next. If mother experiences some type of trauma in her life and she has children, oftentimes she'll pass it on to her kids, even though maybe the child or the children didn't experience the trauma directly. It's passed on later on in their life, especially if mom or if dad, it could be mother or father, doesn't deal with the traumatic experiences. It's kind of like post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, you have people who go to Iraq, Afghanistan, they come back home, they suffer from PTSD. Then when they come home, it's not like they're the only people who suffer and deal with it. The family has to deal with it. And then if they get married and they have children, it can be passed on to that generation. And so I think post-traumatic stress disorder might help us understand a little bit about historical trauma. And again, it doesn't have to be Native Americans. It could be any other group who's dealt with extreme oppression. So the word colonialism popped up, and I wanted to define that. And basically, colonialism is military, economic, cultural oppression and domination of one country, race over another. And so here in the United States, what you had was first a military effort part of the United States government. Before the United States government, the English or the French or the Spanish moving into Indian territories, forcing people off their land, in some cases committing mass murder, committing genocide. And then after that, you have economic oppression. For example, when the Spanish first move into the Caribbean, not only do they from a military standpoint, conquer Native Americans, but the survivors are then forced to work in silver mines and gold mines. In some cases, they die there by the thousands. Here in the United States, of course, Native Americans weren't sought fit to be slaves, but they were driven off their homelands, and of course, their land was then used to build up the various plantations in the South. American Indian labor wasn't used, and so African labor was used, right, in the form of slavery. And of course, it really does help build up the United States. Without slavery, without the resources that come from North America, South America, you don't see the development of the United States. At least that's what I would argue. Lastly, and this is probably the most important one right here, is the cultural oppression. And so what you see is first a military effort to colonize, then an economic effort, and then lastly, this last effort, the few people who survive, this effort to forcibly assimilate the remaining population, to take them out of their environment and force them to adopt a different identity. Probably, at least in my view, probably the most damaging to Native Americans, the most damaging, because it's a type of psychological trauma. And I've even had conversations with Native Americans and other people, and I thought, well, it may have been better for some of the people who died and were just killed, because imagine having, not just your culture attacked, but then being told you can't speak your language, can't practice your customs, can't practice your religion, can't wear your traditional clothing, and then being told that your parents' religion, their form of spirituality is somehow inferior, right, to the dominant population. So this has tremendous consequences. So again, first you have the invasion, settlement. We tend to look at, the settling of America as a good thing, but the settling of America also equates with the depopulation of the first people who live here. And then you have internal colonialism. You have groups who survived that initial military process. Well, what do we do with these people? Well, you put them on Indian reservations. Or in Mexico, you force them to work in silver and gold mines, or you force them to work in missions like you did in California with the Native Americans who become your very first Christians. Number 4, neocolonialism. That's the type of colonialism that is often masked or it's kind of covered up, right? You say, well, we're trying to help these people, we're trying to help them economically, but then under, kind of behind their back, you're stealing their coal and their natural gas and their resources. This is what's happened to a lot of Native Americans when they are forced onto Indian reservations. They find out that they have a lot of resources on those lands. And so corporations come in with the help of the federal government, and they often steal the resources that are left behind. And believe it or not, Native Americans were forced off of the majority of their lands, but often they were put on lands that were super wealthy with coal, natural gas, copper, gold, especially uranium. Of course, uranium is used to build atomic weapons. The majority of the uranium that was mined here in the United States comes from uranium in Native American territories. So again, what is multi-generational trauma, historical trauma? It's cultural trauma. It's an attack on the fabric of a society. What makes a society unique? Well, it's their culture. When you take that culture from them, what makes them any different than any other group? And of course, affecting the essence of the community and its members, historical trauma, again, the cumulative exposure of traumatic events. Again, these traumatic events starting in 1492 with war after war, then eventually forced removals, eventually boarding school systems, and then this kind of psychological attack on your culture. So it says right here, the collective emotional and psychological injury, both of the lifespan and across generations, resulting from the cataclysmic history of genocide. And so in my view, historical trauma, at least as it pertains to Native Americans, is certainly connected to genocide. Now, there's some who've told me, well, the term genocide wasn't developed till Raphael Lemkin helped put together the Geneva Convention on Genocide after World War II. And so you can't use the term genocide to apply it to Native Americans, but using that logic, then you can say that there was a Holocaust. At least you couldn't call it a genocide because the term didn't come into existence till after World War II. And so the logic really doesn't fit. I've had people say, well, this happened before the term genocide was created. I'm like, well, the term genocide was created after what happened during World War II. So should we then not call what happened to the Jews genocide? Of course not. Of course it was a genocide. And people say, well, you can't call it genocide because most people died of diseases. Well, if in World War II most Holocaust victims died of diseases. I mean, who's the most famous Holocaust victim? You guys know? Anne Frank. What did she die of? She died of typhus. I mean, because she was forced to live in conditions that were really unhealthy. Most Native Americans, when they go onto Indian reservations, they're forced to live in these horrendous conditions and they end up contracting diseases and dying. And so the disease excuse I often hear, it just rings hollow with me because the majority of Native Americans died of diseases often because of the conditions that they're forced to live in, very similar to the conditions that Jews are forced to live in during the Nazi period. Again, multi-generational trauma occurs when trauma is not resolved, like we were talking about. Mom doesn't resolve her experiences, and then it's passed on to the kids. It's internalized, passed from one generation to the next. And that comes from Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who's one of the first Native Americans to talk about multi-generational trauma. I just wanted to bring up the Geneva Convention, or the United Nations Convention on Genocide, and I'll go ahead and read it. It says, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group includes 5 types of criminal actions. Killing members of the group. So number 1, you could attempt to kill them all. And most people think that that's really the only type of genocide, is where you're trying to exterminate the entire group. But not according to the United Nations. There's other types as well, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group. So if you psychologically torment a group, that could be considered genocide, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part. That's significant as well, because it's not like you're making a concerted effort to kill them, but you may just make their life so miserable that they die. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So preventing the women in those childbearing years from being able to exercise their reproductive rights can be considered genocide. And of course, transferring children of the group to another group. That's significant to me, because over 100,000 Native American kids were transferred from their homes. Imagine if you're a child, 3 years old, you don't speak English, somebody comes, knocks on the door, and your mother or father answers, and they basically tell your parents, oh, we want your child, we're going to take them away, we're going to take your child away from you, and we're going to send them off to a school. Let's say mom and dad resist and say, no, you can't do that. Well, they pass certain laws that basically allow the government to do it. They could arrest the parents or deny the parents provisions needed to survive. One of the issues that a lot of people overlooked is that when Native Americans are forced onto reservations, they're basically forced into dependency. They're told, you can't be independent like you once were. We're going to provide you with everything that you need to survive. But if you don't give us your kids, we're not going to provide those things. And in some cases, they just took the kids. And you can imagine what that would be like for a little kid. As young as 3. They would take them as young as 3. And just some quotes here. This is from General William Tecumseh Sherman. But the more we can kill this year, the less we have to kill, or less have to be killed in the next war. For the more I see these Indians, the more I'm convinced that they have all to be killed or be maintained as a species of paupers. That's a United States general. He's a war general. Of the Indian Wars and also the Civil War. Thank you. Somebody said it, Civil War. Yeah. Okay, so I have a quote I wanted to read to you as well here on my phone. This is John Oberle, and there's numerous quotes like this. I don't show you guys that just yet, but this is a quote by John Oberle. He's a superintendent of Indian schools, and he was in charge with educating or forcibly assimilating Indians. And he ruthlessly stated that Indian schools needed to wean students from the degrading communism of tribal reservation systems and to imbue in him the exalting egotism of American civilization, so that he will say I instead of we, and that this is mine instead of this is ours. And so you could see the mentality. It's just awful. It's absolutely horrifying when you really start looking into this history, and it's incredible. And of course, they're accused of being semi-communist because they believe in this idea of sharing. What's mine is yours. If I have food and you don't have food, it is my job as a human being to share with you. That's what human beings do. They share. And so, sadly, that was viewed as an inferior value system, this idea of sharing. And so often what they would do is they would try to split up families. They would force them to move far apart so that they wouldn't live collectively in communities. That was a tactic. There was a law that was put into practice called the Allotment Act, and it was set up to basically allot territories to certain families so that when they lived on their land, they wouldn't live next to another family member, and so they wouldn't share, they wouldn't be involved in this kind of communism, as the superintendent of Indian Affairs called it. Just some examples. I know these images are striking, but I think that they help us understand what exactly how brutal the conquest was. On one side, you have the Jewish Holocaust, and you can see the bodies that are lined up, and obviously, hundreds of thousands of people are murdered, and in some cases they're just dumped into mass graves and they're buried there, and who knows how many graves are still exist in Europe and have yet to be uncovered, maybe never will be uncovered. Well, we have places like that too. The one right here, this is Wounded Knee, and the massacre at Wounded Knee. They killed over 300 members of the Lakota Nation. They killed them, and then a storm came in a couple days later. After the storm left, they paid people $2 a body to go and collect the bodies, and they basically dumped them in this mass grave here. And it was filled with women, children, old people. The oldest person to be killed was their leader, a guy by the name of Bigfoot, and he was 90 years old, and he couldn't even walk at the time they were carrying him, and they murdered him, and he had his picture taken when they go back in to retrieve his body, and he's basically frozen stiff in the snow. It's just really horrifying. Even more horrifying is they actually gave away 19 Congressional Medals of Honor to American soldiers who participated in the massacre. If you can believe that, it's the highest award you can earn. Yeah, and the Lakota have always maintained that those Medals of Honor should be stripped, posthumously taken back, which I think would be super, super controversial. There was a little girl. She was found 2 days later after they went back to collect the bodies. Even after this snowstorm came in and all the bodies froze, this little baby was less than a year old. She was in her mother's arms, and she was still alive. She was still alive. And one of the captains or the colonels who participated in the assault on the Lakota ended up adopted her into the family. And she's kind of like a symbol of Lakota strength because, how could this little baby survive in the cold for 2 days, and it's almost a miracle. And so let's just go ahead and talk about just some of the similarities here. Obviously, imprisonment, forced relocation for Native Americans, death, abuse through the boarding school system. This picture right here, this is the Hiawatha asylum for insane Indians. And so a lot of Native Americans would arrest them for practicing their religion, and they were often shipped off to insane asylums, kind of like for re-educating them and reprogramming them to give up their old ways. These are kids that are rounded up and then shipped off to boarding schools, and a lot of these boarding schools, the death rate was extremely high. The kids wouldn't get proper medical care. They'd get sick, and they would die. And the death rate is very similar to a lot of the death camps in Europe, incredibly enough. And so very similar to the Holocaust here, imprisonment, forced relocation, death, and abuse. The numbers are very, very similar as well. In terms of the millions of people who lost their lives and the millions of American Indians who lost their lives here in the conquest. In addition to killing people, forcing them to change their culture, they also assaulted the environment as well. These are stacks and stacks of bison skulls. And they sent out bison hunters out to the Great Plains, basically just to kill off the bison. And at one time, there were about 50 million bison roaming the Great Plains. And by the time 1900 came around, around 1900, there were maybe 500 bison left. And so imagine 50 million down to a couple hundred. These are all bison hides, just stacked. This picture right here is absolutely, it's just incredible. I just can't imagine killing all these bison. But what it does is it helps pacify the people who live out there. They rely on the bison for food. And so it does the job, sadly. It says right here, collective and cumulative emotional wounding across generations. Again, we talked about this historical traumatic events. Again, the trauma is held personally, transmitted over generations. I think what's super problematic is that, so you have these people who experience this trauma. They went to boarding schools. In some cases, they were beaten. Sadly, there was a lot of sexual assault as well, a lot of child molestation, rapes of children. And then these kids come home being tormented psychologically, tormented physically, and then, of course, nobody there to hear their stories. Moreover, then you combine that with the assault on their culture, so they feel ashamed of who they are. They're ashamed to be Native. They're ashamed of it. They're ashamed of their culture. And this is why, in my view, all the years I've studied this issue, in my view, drug abuse, child neglect, domestic violence, it's all, there's a direct line traced back to these experiences by Native Americans. In Native societies prior to the colonial period, there is very little, if any, domestic violence, primarily because women are held in such high esteem in many Native societies. They're not patriarchal societies, they're matriarchal societies for the most part. Additionally, children are rarely hit. They don't believe in striking your child. They don't believe in corporal punishment. And the reason why they didn't believe in corporal punishment is because they felt that they didn't want their kids to fear an authority figure. They didn't believe that that was healthy, that you should live in fear that your parents are going to hit you, that you should behave because you respect your parents, not behave because you think they're going to beat you if you don't behave. And so you behave because of respect, because you're inculcated with this notion that I need to be respectful to my mom and my dad, my grandparents, and if I do something wrong, I'm bringing shame to my community. That's a better way to teach a child, right, is maybe to shame them as opposed to beat them. Make them feel, well, if you do something wrong, you're hurting your community and your family, as opposed to, the other way that often a lot of parents do. Well, now it's just the reverse, and you see a lot of child neglect that you never saw before. And again, this issue of historical trauma, for years it went unstudied until after World War II, and some of your Holocaust survivors were dealing with issues, and you can imagine why a Holocaust survivor would be dealing with issues. And they attempted to help them because a lot of the kids were having to deal with issues that the parents were dealing with. And so they started looking into issues centered around historical trauma, but the big difference is that the Jews were able to deal with this trauma kind of collectively, and also the whole nation kind of mourned what happened to them. Whereas the trauma experienced by Native Americans was never understood, never even acknowledged. And even to this day, it's still not acknowledged, really. Still not acknowledged. At least not by the federal government. And again, we're trying to figure out ways to deal with the trauma that is in line with our cultural values. We're trying to rebuild our communities, recover what's still around. A lot of our culture just disappeared. So much of indigenous knowledge, indigenous life ways is gone forever. Probably will never be recovered, and that's just the way it is. I mean, a big part of being a unique group is being able to speak your indigenous language, and that was one of the first things they did. They said, "Oh, you cannot speak your language." I mean, they intuitively knew that that was one way to steal their identity, take away their language. You take away their language, you take away their identity. So let's just kind of go through some of the different. This is a model here that was put together, and I really like it. And again, it says trauma, obviously stress, coping, not having good coping issues, or coping strategies, I should say. And of course, that could result in all kinds of negative health outcomes. Obviously, Native Americans suffer from a wide variety of social pathologies, including high suicide rates, high drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, like I was saying, and teenage pregnancy, a variety of social issues. And so, a lot of us in academia really do feel that this goes back to historical trauma experienced by Native people. And until that trauma is acknowledged and dealt with, these issues will persist. I don't want to kind of bore you guys with the research here. I'm going to kind of move through just go real quick here through the 6 phases of historical unresolved grief, just real quick. Again, first contact, which is that life shock, experiencing genocide, no time for grieving. You have diseases, alcohol's introduced, and all these just horrible traumatic events. And then, of course, you have the economic aspect of your life disrupted, invasion, the war period, extermination, the refugee experience, the reservation experience, just forced confinement, dependency, and just a general lack of security. And then, of course, the boarding school system, which was a direct attack on the Native American family, a direct attack on what it meant to be Native American. And again, to me, this is probably the most insidious aspect of the colonial period. Corporal punishment, confinement, beatings, sexual abuse, the destruction of native languages and religion, and of course, just these long-lasting effects. You just don't leave that stuff behind when you go home. You take it with you. Quickly go through our history. I want to show you guys some pictures. They actually did before and after pictures of Native people. And I mean, this was a concerted effort. It wasn't like they said, "Oh, we'll just create schools and we'll throw them in the schools." It was like, no, we're going to create schools to show that we can transform these people, these Native people, into real civilized beings. The mantra was, kill the Indian, save the man. Kill the Indian, save the man. And that's a direct quote from Captain Henry Pratt, who was one of the first people to think of this idea of boarding schools. He said, we can kill the Indian and we can save the person. Kill their culture, essentially. Yeah, kill the culture. Save the man, like save the person by killing the culture. And he was also excited as saying, you transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of civilization, and he'll grow to possess a civilized lifestyle. And these are Indian kids at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is one of the first schools. Yeah. This is another Indian school. I just want to go to the end here. Let's see here. I always show cartoons. I think they're are funny, first of all, but we have all kinds of stereotypes of what it means to be Native American. And so he's saying, really, you don't look like an Indian? And this is what's in his head of what Indians are supposed to be like. He's thinking of Pocahontas and the Redskins and the Cleveland Indians. And this is just another aspect of the dehumanization of Native Americans. This one right here is actually a real logo. This is Chief Wahoo for the Cleveland Indians. And I always say, well, could you imagine if we had switched them with these and how people would feel? Well, how do you think they would feel? Let's say if we switched it to the Africans, the Cleveland Africans. How would people react? Oh, not positively. I don't think so either. Why is this one okay? Yeah, it's not. And these are such archaic, symbols, but yet we still use them. And people, they go to these games, they dress up as Indians, and they do fake chants and whatnot. And Gene does always tell people, Indians don't chant. We don't chant. We sing. We sing, but we don't chant. I'm going to get to the end. So just talk about the nature of decolonization, which means basically kind of undoing what happened in the past. Of course, getting rid of self-negation and having self-affirmation, educating people like we're doing right here. I mean, to me, this is part of the decolonization process, is telling people the stories about what happened. Of course, moving from dependency to self-reliance. Who wants to be dependent? Nobody wants to be dependent, especially on the government. We all want to be able to take care of ourselves. Certainly moving from subordination to equal rights, having equal rights for everybody, powerlessness to self-determination. And I'm going to end with a picture of, again, the modern Native American family. We looked at some old pictures, and here is something a little more recent. And so we want to rebuild our families so they look more like this than some of the other families that are really struggling to make it today. And I can stop right there, and then we can talk, and you guys can ask questions, and yeah.
Where is Define Welfare Asylum located?
I believe it's North Dakota. North Dakota, yeah. It's no longer in existence. I was horrified when I heard this, that they would actually have an insane asylum for people who practice their culture. There were laws that were created in 1880 called the Civilization Regulations, and they were meant to prohibit the practicing of Native American culture. And so you could be fined, you could be arrested for practicing your culture, singing, dancing, holding ceremonies. Yeah.
So when you talk about the historical trauma, we know that there are, in some areas of the United States and their land areas, there are more high concentration of Native American survivors. So would you say that in the West versus, say, like the lower plains, Oklahoma, that area, that there would be less of this trauma had occurred?
No. I think one of the reasons why we don't have very many Native Americans in certain parts of the United States is because of colonialism. And so the areas where Indian people were forced to go, like say Oklahoma, that was a kind of a collective experience of what some people call ethnic cleansing. And so they're all kind of pushed to Oklahoma. And so what happens is that all these people once called Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida home, they're all forced to move to Oklahoma. And so what do they take with them? All that trauma there. And so, the places where you don't see high concentrations of Native Americans at one time had a lot of Native Americans, especially in the southern states. Because of the Indian Removal Act, very few Native Americans exist east of the Mississippi. But at one time, the overwhelming majority of the population was located east of the Mississippi. But 1830 Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson comes along and says, "Oh, you can't stay here." And the native people of these territories said, "Well, why not? We're doing just fine. We're coexisting pretty well." And he said, "Well, that's too bad. You guys have gold and we want it. You have nice territories, we want it. You have land that should go to European immigrants, and you're just going to have to go." And so they removed them. Told them they had to leave. Some people know it as the Trail of Tears, and some people call it the Trail of Tears. I say that there's probably a few hundred Trail of Tears, because the experience of say the Cherokee removal, although horrible, absolutely horrible, that was the experience of a lot of Native tribes. It just so happens that we know a little more about what happened to the Cherokee. The Cherokee are forced to move, and when they move, when they're marched from their homeland to Oklahoma, about a third of the tribe dies along the way. Yeah. Indian Territory, that's what they called it. Indian country. That's right. Yeah.
What's being done to change typical American schools to assist in the education about this issue? I taught history, and all of the history books I got came from Texas. And we know why.
Yes,
but they have a slanted view and very little information other than the Indian Wars was the conquest of the Indians, by the way. Yeah. That was the story.
Yeah. Very little progress, I think, has been made, generally speaking. But there's some schools that do a pretty good job of it, of teaching the history, doing a better job, I should say. They do a better job. But like you said, most of the history books, they're developed in Texas, and they're really skewed. And if you do get, say, I don't know, an indigenous perspective, it's like this small, maybe a page. And so I just don't think that the United States, collectively, the United States really wants to talk about these issues, because what it does is it's kind of a stain on our national honor. And so we want to kind of keep that kind of hidden away, so to speak. If we talk about it, then you got to deal with it. If you, like right now, we're having a conversation about it, having dialogue. We can't say we don't know anymore. But if you don't talk about it, you don't acknowledge it, well, then you really don't have to do anything. Yeah, so, some schools, children learn still, 2015, here you would think, 21st century, they get the old stereotypical views that I was taught about Native Americans back in, the 80s when I was going to school. Yeah. My son goes to CompuTech, which is a school in West Fresno. It's a pretty good school, and I'm always surprised. He comes home and he learns all these things about slavery and American Indians that I never learned as a kid. And so every now and then there's a school, they do a better job. And then, most of the schools, though, the teachers are just not taught these things. And so they don't even know how to begin teaching American Indian history. Yeah.
I wish I had the internet available to me when I was teaching, because of the ability to gather the information. Yeah. But it was so difficult to do and to try to develop any kind of lessons on it.
I didn't learn American Indian history until I decided to get it myself. I wasn't taught the history growing up. It wasn't until I was out of high school when I first started reading about American Indian history, and I loved it. I just thought it was great because I wasn't taught any of it. It was just kind of like, well, Indians are here, but they're in the way, and we have manifest destiny, and we have to go from sea to shining sea. right? And we would sing the songs about how glorious the colonial period was. And of course, from, I guess, the colonist perspective, it is a rather wonderful story. But from the people's perspective, the indigenous people's perspective, it's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. Yeah, so it depends on perspective. And what I always tell my students, that history is not just a series of dates and times. History is about what happened to individuals, what individuals experienced, in some cases, what an individual community experienced. And so the experiences for all of us in this room, all of our individual experiences, is essentially history. But did we all experience everything the same? No. We all have our own experiences. And so we don't share the same history. You couldn't just look at history and just teach the dates and think that you really get an in-depth understanding of history. People have to understand what happened, what really happened, the different views. And that's why, the way I look at history is that it's not about a date or a time period or a war. It's about what people experienced during that war and what different debates were happening during that time. Because you'll see history change. It depends on the political climate, right? When the political climate changes, all of a sudden our perspective on history changes. Yeah.
A few years ago, I took this wonderful class on diversity at City College.
Okay.
And it's all that subject. It's all about diversity.
Can I ask you your teacher?
I can't remember her name. She was so good. She's probably still teaching.
Carla Kirk? Is it Carla Kirk? No.
Anyway, she had us go right down to our own families. How we're all different. People the world over are different, but my family's different than my husband's family was. We get right down to everyday things, the way you do stuff. And I just feel like the world over knows nothing about diversity. It's totally ignored as a subject or a way to get along.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's easy to just kind of homogenize a group than try to understand them. Just look at a group and say they're all this way or they're all that way, as opposed to trying to understand how people are different.
Expect differences.
Yeah.
That was the big
So hard for a lot of people because it requires us to think. It requires us to use the rational side of our mind as opposed to kind of taking the easy way out, which is to label someone, to stereotype someone. It's always easier to do that. Yeah. And so you'll hear people say, well, those people are this way, those people are that way. And it's incredibly short-sighted to look at things that way. And you miss so much. You miss like the beauty of all this difference that exists in the world. I mean, around the world, there's today still over 6,000 languages spoken around the world. That's amazing. 6,000 ways of looking at life. 6,000 ways of understanding life and looking at family and understanding the world. I mean, that's incredible to me. But we don't really even push that type of diversity on our children. We don't encourage them to learn to speak different languages. And so, it's so backwards. We learn a different language as we get older. We should be learning languages when we're young. That's when our brains are really capable of learning different languages. As we get older, I jokingly say that we get dumber, because our brains begin to shut down a little bit. And so, I mean, and the science even says so. As we get older, often it becomes difficult to learn another language because the pathways in the brain actually, they shut down. And when you're a kid, if you open up those pathways by exposing them to a variety of different languages and different sounds, it actually does stimulate the brain. And so that's why if you look at cultures that are multilingual, that speak different languages, they tend to be less narrow-minded. They tend to be very, very open to diversity and difference. Monolingual cultures tend to be very, very prejudiced and discriminatory because we don't understand other people and why they're different. And so we assume it's bad. Well, it's not like us, so it must be doing something wrong.
Can you offer suggestions as to what we might do?
Well, I mean, the first step, like I said, I think is just educating yourself. And, some people say, well, these issues are so big and, this is just the way the world is. But, when we change our perspectives, we change the people around us. We change the way we think, we change our loved ones. And in some cases in small ways, but those small ways can lead to really, really wonderful things. It's kind of like, I'm sure you may have heard of the butterfly effect, the butterfly flapping its wings, and it could create, chaos and whatnot around the world. But it could do just the opposite. It could create something wonderful as well. And so, raising our kids to be respectful of diversity and to understand other people. I mean, to me, that's a beautiful gift to give the people around you. And also just, understanding that that the past belongs to all of us as well. It's our collective past. And so maybe, our ancestors weren't involved in some of these things, but we're where we're at today. And so, which means that we have to do our best to help, I know it sounds kind of corny, but help humanity kind of take a step forward. And I think it's all of our duty to do our part, especially in a country like ours. I truly believe that as an American, we're so darn blessed here. I mean, we're so blessed to be Americans and to live in this country. I complain all the time about what's going on here, and I complain about what happened to Native people, especially among friends, and what's still going on in Native communities. But I would rather be indigenous here than be indigenous in Mexico, or to be indigenous in South America, because to be indigenous there, whoa, I mean, these people are just struggling just to make it. And so, we live in a country where we have a lot of opportunity, which means that we have opportunity to do something good with our lives and to help other people. So, but I think once we make changes personally in the way that we think, you'd be surprised how it affects people. It impacts people. It's very impactful. And also being brave enough too to be able to stand your ground when you hear ignorance. I always challenge people to stand their ground. There's more people who are open and loving and compassionate out there. There's more people out there than we think, and we just have to find those people. The people who are hateful and ugly, they just, what's that saying? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. I mean, they just get all the media time and whatnot, but there's really more of us who care and who are loving and compassionate. We just have to find others that are like us and work together. At least I believe that. I truly believe that. Some people, they question that, but I think that there's a lot of good people out there. We just have to learn to find each other.
Question.
Okay.
So big, what do you do?
Yeah, it's like I teach sociology and I teach about social problems. Were you in my sociology class too? Yeah. Some of the problems that societies face with, they're so big. There's that Hawaiian story. I think it's a Hawaiian story about the kid. He's walking on a beach, and the starfish they're washed up, right? And he's tossing them back in. There's starfish everywhere, and an older gentleman comes along and says, "Well, there's just too many, and there's nothing you can do. You can't make a difference." And the kid picks up the starfish and throws it in the ocean and says, "Well, I made a difference for that one. I made a difference for that one." have to, we have to try. We have to try, and when we learn about certain issues, we also have to then act as well. So it's not enough just to learn. It's not enough just to acquire information. You have to put it into action in some way, even in small ways. It doesn't have to be where you become an activist and you spend your entire life, working on social justice. It's not about that, but in some way we have to then take action. We have to find our way. It could be, maybe just talking to our children, talking to our friends, continuing to learn about the issues. Maybe, doing some type of volunteer work, and just choosing an issue and working on that issue. There's so many issues I want to work on because there's so many things out in this world that I feel like are wrong, and I want to get out there and do something, but I don't have all the time in the world to do these things, and so I have to decide, well, these are the issues that I can work on. These issues I just have to do my best to try to keep up on. And there's issues that I obviously American Indians and historical trauma is something that I've spent a lot of years studying. Primarily, I think, because I wanted to understand why Native American families, especially my own family, at times could be so darn dysfunctional, and why things were the way they were. I just wanted to understand it. And I wanted to understand why I didn't get to learn the things that I learned later on in life. And I felt robbed of this rich history. Yeah. But there's so many other issues. One of the issues I work on as much as I can is global slavery today is something that I try to do something about. And the prison industrial complex, the fact that we have millions of people locked up in jails and prisons, and we have families that are kids that don't have parents, and you can't. It just goes, anything that has to do with the destruction of the family kind of hits home with me. And so, the mistreatment of women and sexual violence and sexual assault is something that really hits home for me and bothers me, and something that I try to work on as much as I can. And so, issues related to domestic violence and sexual assault. I think a lot of it, at least for me, looking at a lot of these issues, I could look at the experiences of Native Americans, and I could see how a lot of the other problems that we all have collectively here in the United States kind of go back to what happened to Native people. Issues centered around greed and people who don't care about other people's well-being just because they want to get money. That's an issue that, this country's been dealing with for a long time. And it goes back to the stealing of Indian lands. It was all about greed. It was all about greed. Well, what happened in 2008? We had people who were stealing millions upon millions of people's dollars and giving them bad investments and turning around and then, making money off of people who they were selling bad investments to. And so I think the problems that we had, 100, 200 years ago, they still exist today.
Our youth group is going to go to a reservation in New Mexico this summer. Most of our youth group are moms who have suffered their own
That's right.
historic trauma. And is there any kind of insight you can offer for our kids who are going to be taking this trip?
Have an open heart to understand that people have had difficulties, and a lot of the people who have experienced this trauma don't even know they have it. Don't even know they do. And I think just having an open heart and being willing to listen and be willing to do your part to help out, and just remaining open. Yeah, that's the best thing that we can do. We help communities out. We ask what needs to be done. How can we be of assistance? I think that is probably the most important thing that I've learned over the years working in communities, is what is it that I could do to help you? What role would you like me to play, if any role at all?
I was established at the University for 10 years, 76 to 2000. And that's why I say that the child in the basket kind of reminded me when I was growing up. My mom had me one of those things.
Yeah.
I'll try to can't imagine that as big as I am now. But anyway, going back to Stanford University, every day they make meetings again. You couldn't understand why, they would do the dance, like I said, it was not hard.
Yeah.
And the students didn't understand. And we were at the university. And also, when I worked there was an incident that happened with, I guess, there was a period when the kids was vacation time. I was standing there. And when the student said, how come you're back there? Mom and Dad were to yours, so we said, come back. Why couldn't we get back to yours? One more English teacher. Then I just went to the ballistics, And that's about when they came up composure. But also angry, And they kind of, back out back in the 70s, whatever. But that concept still exists today. As you mentioned about the communism earlier in the lecture. And when I was searching on you, the student comment that you had different views. So the time distance, hasn't really changed that much. And so it's kind of, to me, it's kind of amusing, I got laughed at it, but the tragedy of it, and what can you do about that?
Yeah, humor and laughter it's a very powerful, I think, thing that you can do in the face of this type of trauma, right? Learning to find humor in it, and we always make fun about how we had so little to eat. We had so little. We just having, making fun of how we were able to make it and how we were able to survive growing up, and just trying to find, the positives as much as you could.
We did a repetition reconciliation at Providence.
Beautiful.
Yeah, we call that, they repetitions. And touch someone, basically the same thing. And I'd like to add that this church, Central Valley, is one of the first ones to make that dialogue. So people ask me, what can we do?
Yeah,
That's an amazing step.
it is. Absolutely is. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, my tattoo. Well, this one right here definitely represents my culture. It has these are kind of like representation of mountains, and it has 7 points, which is kind of it's not kind of, it is symbolic of the 7 generations. And so this notion that when you think about, the welfare of your communities, you don't just want to think about yourself, obviously, you want to think about everybody, but you should always think about future generations. And so the 7 generations, the 7 directions, you have the 4 directions, and then you have the sky, you have the earth, and then you have your heart. That's number 7. Yeah. Just cultural reminders. Yeah.
All of us are learning here and getting some greater intelligence in terms of Native Americans. But we could all leave tomorrow or when we're finished with this series and forget the whole thing.
Yeah.
What do you recommend that a person would do to constantly keep growing in terms of American Indian
Invite us back next year. Invite us back next year, and I think what we could do collectively would be to maybe do some events together. Like when you guys are doing something, maybe we can come out and help you. And then when we're doing something, maybe y'all can come out and help us. Yeah. Whatever, yeah. I mean, I think that's something, is that once we make the connection, then you keep the connection. And so we come back next year, and we do something together, and then we find a time where when you guys need help with something, and you're looking for extra bodies, and we can help out. And then when we need some help with something, then you guys can help us out. Yeah. Developing the relationships. But you're right, that's a problem. I mean, you know, I read about so many different issues, and I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I could do something. And then you read about another issue, and then the next thing you know, you forget. Life happens, and you totally forget. But I think, you know, just maintaining the connections that you make as much as you can, helping out different groups. I think, you know, taking, you know, people to an Indian reservation, that's a wonderful thing. There's so many different places around America that are in need, but especially in Indian country, I mean, there's some places that are really in need. Here in the valley, we have, you know, communities in need, and you know, Gene knows for years I'm like Mr. Event Planner. I don't even really like planning events, but I get thrusted into all these different events, and I've put on some huge events over the years, some big ones. The last one was last November. We had a lot of fun, huh? Yeah, we had a lot of fun. But yeah, whenever we have a procession, maybe you guys come out and march with us. And yeah, we have events. Well, Fresno City College, I'll say this, in November, we're going to be doing a big event for our Native American youth, and we'll have probably a big procession, and we usually march through campus. And so having you guys come out for that, joining us. So, huh?
Keep us notified.
Will do. Yeah. That'll be in November. We have, I think, an exact date. We don't have a save the date flyer, but as soon as we do, I can ship it out to you guys. Yeah, because that event, we get people from all over. It's not just Native Americans. We have a lot of friends. You know, we need friends from outside of our communities. The more friends that we develop, relationships, the better. But yeah, I guess the best way I can answer your question, just to stay involved as much as we can, stay connected. You know, and when you guys are doing something, like I said, something happens here, if you ever get involved in the community, letting us know, and we can get involved and help out as well. Yeah. Yeah. We are.
Where we have so much diversity.
Yeah.
We really
Without a
have
doubt.
huge diversity.
So much diversity here. It's amazing.
And not only with the Indians, it's with all.
So many different groups. You have, you know, Native Americans, Hmongs, Laotians, people from Cambodia, all over Asia, Vietnamese, and you have Armenians, and you know, some of my students are from Russia. We have people, you know, we have people who are Jewish, Christian, Muslim, from all over the world. It really is. Hispanics, and from people from Mexico, people born here, people of Mexican descent, people from Guatemala, El Salvador. Yeah, I mean, I'm just people from all over the Filipinos here. We have just so many amazing cultures. It's really wonderful. I think it's great. I like it. But some people, you know.
This
2 weeks, okay.
The multicultural is on Sunday.
Oh,
Sunday. Yeah. And, you know, we have Hmong and the rest of us.
Yeah.
But the rest of us, including Armenian, Filipino, Nigerian, and that kind of stuff, we certainly would welcome a presence of Native American.
Like I said, I would love to come out to events. I know Michael would as well. He'd come out and, like I said, this year, it could just be a step. And then next year, take another step, and, continue to kind of grow the relationship. Yeah. And, for me, this is something that I enjoy doing it. I enjoy coming doing presentations, and I enjoy, speaking to people, and I feel too, it's kind of my, responsibility as well. I've learned so much, and I feel it's my responsibility to share and to educate people, and I'm still getting educated myself. Every time I think I know a lot, I just realize, oh man, I don't hardly know anything, and there's some other area of life that I start to explore. I'm just like, wow. I personally love to learn, so I enjoy learning. Yeah.
Is there any books that authors?
Gosh, the best books I could recommend. It would depend on the topic. Is there a topic that you're interested in learning about Native Americans?
Dancing the Dream.
Dancing the Dream, I don't think I've ever heard of it. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, I've never heard of it. Well, I say that if you read one person, it would be Vine Deloria. Vine Deloria Jr. Anything by Vine Deloria Jr. I think would be worth reading. He writes about history, Native Americans history, Native Americans in law, Native Americans in spirituality, philosophy, just about any of those. But yeah, if you want to learn about history, B. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a really good history book. A lot of good stories in there. If you want to learn about the boarding school system that we learned about here just a little bit, there's a book by Ward Churchill. I can't remember the name of it exactly. It's just a short book. It's all about the boarding school system. Again, those topics are really, really tough to read about. At least they are for me. It's really, really hard. But I use a book that's really, really good as well. It's about the environment by Daniel Wildcat called Red Alert. It's just a short pamphlet. It's really, really good because it's about Native philosophy, traditions, religion, and environmental issues. That's one big area that we need to start working on is how are we going to protect the environment? That way we can pass on a healthy world to the next generation. So Daniel Wildcat and Red Alert. Winona LaDuke has a book called Recovering the Sacred, which is really good. Great book. Winona LaDuke. Recovering the Sacred is great. And she has an older book. It's about 15 years old, called All Our Relations, I believe. I think it's All Our Relations. It's really good as well.
President State, have any speakers coming?
Not this time of the year. I'm sure next year they'll be having some speakers, some Native American speakers show up. Fresno City College, we'll try to bring somebody in. But as of right now, I'm not sure yet. Towards the beginning of the school year, the academic year, we'll know more who will be coming in. Yeah. But there's so many good books. I love books. I can just read. I'm particular about my books. There's some books I can read, and there's a lot of books I just can't. Depending, it has to be the right type of topic, or I'm not big on fiction. I'm not big on fiction. I want to read about what's really happening in the world, not some made up stuff. But some people love fiction; they love poetry. I'm not a big poetry person, and
Yeah. Small gem of
it's true. But it's still not real, though. But you're right. Yeah. But people's experiences and their psychology. Yeah. I mean, there's been a few books. There's an author by the name of Sherman Alexie. Sherman Alexie? Or Sherman Alexie, yeah. Yeah, he was at Fresno State about a month ago. And I've read a few of his books, and they're really, really good. But it's fiction. Yeah, and I'm just like, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's true. That is true. And his books did that for me, I think, too. His books allow you to kind of explore the psychology of a particular situation or a particular individual or group, even. But yeah, I'm a sociologist, and I'm not a creative writer. I've done a lot of research and writing, and I'm like a very straightforward kind of person. And in the social sciences, we're not very creative. We leave that to the humanities. The art and humanities, they're more creative minds than we are. But yeah, but anything on history, I love. It doesn't have to be Native American. It could be any kind of history. I just love history. Yeah, history is just great. Just learning about the human story. It's fascinating. There's so many stories to be told.
Right, so I'm going to step in here. We have so enjoyed our time together, and we are enjoying little Eva. Also very cute at the back. So we do want to invite you to come in 2 weeks from tonight. We're having our, because we have so many cultures here, and in Christian tradition, there's a celebration called Pentecost, when we celebrate the diversity of language and culture. And
that's
so,
beautiful.
Yeah,
that's
so
beautiful.
we'll celebrate that. There will be some real interesting, different people bringing different cultural things, and we would totally welcome your presence and participation if you'd like to bring something along.
That'd be really nice.
It's going to be at 6 o'clock, 2 weeks from tonight.
2 weeks from tonight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. 2 weeks from yesterday, what we're talking about, we have a big United Methodist Church has an organization we call it UMCOR. It's the United Methodist Committee on Relief. And one of the things that UMCOR does is they have relief kits that we pack up and warehouse. And when anything happens, we got the kits ready to go. And because we're a worldwide denomination, we have connections everywhere. We're sending aid in to help people in a variety of ways. And so on the 16th in the morning, on Saturday the 16th in the morning, we're going to be packing up health kits and school kits and layettes. And we're going to have breakfast at 9, and afterwards we'll pack kits up that we'll ship to the closest warehouse for us is in Salt Lake City. And then they'll combine that all and get it on pallets. And then, for example, even in Baltimore, they burned down a CVS. The people need health kits, so they ship health kits to it. So beautiful. Anywhere in the world, when something happens, we're mobilized. And so You're welcome to join us for that as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then we'll keep you posted. We have other big things coming, really fun ones coming up too, but especially
Maybe
the 16th and 17th.
Michael Youngblood.
Can you let Michael know he's sing? Do you have his contact info? Okay.
Facebook. I don't do Facebook,
I know,
yeah.
but Lance has his
Yeah.
Facebook stuff, so.
Yeah, maybe you can stay in touch with him, because he has another group of people that they do a lot of that kind of work as well.
Nice. Very
Yeah.
nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
I do want to lift up, because I know, I feel, as I'm seeing at the back, and I kind of feel, I think several of you, like me, are like going in, how can we fix it? What can we do to fix it? And it's not something that's going to get fixed in, next week, let's do a project and now it's fixed. It's like you say, fight people back, build the relationships, work together. But there is one thing that I think that I would encourage people to do that is, and it's kind of the whole stand your ground sort of thing, but there is a growing movement in our country currently called American exceptionalism. And a part of that is to say that this country is better than everyone else and to actively deny any mistakes that were made. If you say, if you question anything, you're unpatriotic, and it's to be removed from history books. And I would encourage us to be very, very vocal and very lovingly forthright in challenging that concept, because to deny mistakes is to ingrain mental illness into the fabric of our society. And who wants to do that? It really does. You have to own your mistakes, and you have to look for healing, and you can't do that if you're not allowed to vocalize what mistakes have been made, and there have been plenty of mistakes made, and so we want to stop denying that, and we want to encourage people to be honest. I was raised to believe it's a very patriotic thing to question.
That's right.
To work for the health and wholeness and the improvement of your country rather than to say we're perfect now and always have been. That's illness and it's unhealthy. So I would encourage all of us to become educated about and articulate in our ability to lovingly refute concepts of American exceptionalism, and because they're actively trying to influence textbooks in our schools. That's the biggest thing. They're actively trying to influence textbooks. So it will remove from history anything that might not shine a glorious light on the United States. And again, I think that just ingrains mental illness. So I would encourage us to be vocal about that. One thing that we can be involved in right now and can influence future generations, because if those textbooks get put in, they cycle around for like a decade, and so it's a whole nother generation that's not being allowed to even explore
That's a good point.
different aspects. So.
Yeah. Armenian genocide, yeah.
Revision.
Right. Well, and for me personally, I just listened to that whole thing, and I'm thinking, well, that's the policy of North Korea. Why do we want to model our society after North Korea of all the countries on the planet? That would be like, what?
Yeah.
Don't we want to do like the opposite of that? But no, that's the exact policy of North Korea, and it sounds like of Turkey as well. And these are not societies that are generating a lot of health that we want to emulate, I don't think.
That's right.
Not that there's no beauty, but those policies are not helping bring that out.
That's right.
Okay.
Such a good point.
So we thank you so much. Is there one more thing you want to tell us before we go?
It's just been a pleasure. It really has been a pleasure, and like I said, I enjoy doing this, and I've known you for quite a few years now, and you watched me do this, and this is really what I do. This is something that I love, just exploring issues and talking with people and having dialogue. And I just encourage you guys to continue dialoguing with people, family members, and we have to try to connect with one another as much as we can. And so I just want to thank you guys for giving me an opportunity to do that here.
We thank you so much. And so we'll keep in touch and see. I think we could do it next year. It's fun. I'm always down for that, and we'll keep in touch. Derek has something to offer too. A group picture of the class. Okay, let's have a little closing prayer, and then let's all come and gather right up here. Okay. All right, God, we thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for being able to sit in this holy space and receive the sacred stories of pain, of trauma that's been suffered and endured, and to know that your loving presence is wrapping your arms around all who are suffering and inviting us to come together to bring healing and wholeness to all your peoples. We thank you most especially that Dr. Navarro was able to come and share with us from his years of study and his own personal life. We thank you for the many people whose stories he is sharing with us. We ask that you would help us as we continue to grow in our relationships with each other, that this might be just the beginning of the blossoming of some beautiful, beautiful garden that truly glorifies who you are and the diversity of the creation you have made. We ask that you would bless us as we depart from this place tonight, keep us safe and give us a good night's rest, and help us every day to find ways to just splash your love on everyone who crosses our path. We pray this in your precious holy name. Amen. So let's well, I'll just come and get around. Okay, so everybody, he's going to be right here on the stool, and we'll all just kind of be close in around him so we can get it in the shot.